I remember everything about that night. The way the rain caught the streetlights and turned them into watercolor smears across the windshield. The low hum of the heater mixing with the soft jazz playing from the driver's phone. The smell in the back seat, something citrusy from an air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, layered over the faint cologne that Julian wore. Something warm and woody that I'd been trying not to notice all evening. We weren't supposed to be sharing this ride. The dinner had run late, and most of our friends had already left the restaurant in pairs or small groups, scattering into the November night. Julian and I found ourselves the last two standing on the sidewalk, both headed uptown, both too polite to suggest we shouldn't split the fare. It seemed practical, economical, safe. I should have known better. The driver was a quiet man with kind eyes who didn't try to make conversation, which I was grateful for. I settled into the far corner of the back seat, my body angled toward the window, watching the city blur past in ribbons of light and shadow. Julian slid in beside me, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the small space between us. We had been talking all evening, about books, about the exhibition we'd seen earlier that week, about nothing important and everything that mattered. But now, in the intimate darkness of the back seat, words felt impossible. I could hear him breathing, steady and deliberate, like he was thinking about something he couldn't say. I found myself matching his rhythm without meaning to, our chests rising and falling in quiet synchronization. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was charged, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes when the air itself seems to hold its breath. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my wedding ring catching the occasional flash of passing headlights. I'd worn it for 15 years. It had become so much a part of me that I rarely noticed its weight anymore. But tonight, it felt heavy, conspicuous, like a brand. Julian shifted beside me, and I felt rather than saw him turn slightly in my direction. I could sense him looking at me, studying my profile in the dim light. I didn't turn to meet his gaze. I wasn't brave enough for that. Instead, I focused on the rain-slicked streets outside, on the late-night pedestrians hurrying between doorways, on anything except the man sitting 18 inches away from me who had somehow managed to turn my carefully ordered world sideways. That's when it happened. His hand moved first, just a slight adjustment, his fingers uncurling from where they'd been resting on his thigh. I felt the back of his hand brush against mine, so lightly it could have been an accident, a coincidence, the natural movement of two people sharing a small space. But it wasn't an accident. The touch was deliberate, tentative, a question asked without words. I should have moved my hand away, should have shifted closer to the window, created more distance between us, should have done any number of things that would have preserved the careful boundaries I'd spent my entire adult life constructing. Instead, I stayed perfectly still. A heartbeat passed, then another. The city continued to slide by outside the windows, oblivious to the small revolution happening in the back seat of a Toyota Camry. Julian's fingers found mine then, not grabbing or clutching, but settling over them with a gentleness that made my throat tight. His palm was warm and slightly rough, and when he laced our fingers together, I felt something inside my chest crack open. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched with intention, with tenderness. Clara and I had been married so long that our physical contact had become perfunctory. Quick kisses goodbye, absent-minded pats on the shoulder, the mechanical intimacy of people who shared a bed but had stopped really seeing each other years ago. This was different. This was Julian's thumb tracing a slow circle over my knuckles. This was the careful way he held my hand like it was something precious, something worth protecting. I couldn't breathe properly. The air in the car felt thin, insufficient. My heart was beating so hard I was certain Julian could feel it through my palm, through the vibration traveling up my arm. I wondered if he could sense how completely undone I was by this simple gesture, how it felt like coming home and falling apart at the same time. The driver turned onto Julian Street, and I felt my time running out like sand through an hourglass. In a few moments, this would be over. Julian would let go of my hand, step out into the rain, and disappear into his building. I would continue on to my house in Westchester, to my sleeping wife and children, to my life of carefully maintained appearances. But for now, for these last few precious seconds, I allowed myself to hold on. Julian's building appeared through the rain, its yellow brick facade glowing under the streetlights. The driver pulled to the curb and announced our arrival in a soft voice that seemed too loud in the hushed interior of the car. Julian's grip on my hand tightened almost imperceptibly, and then, slowly, reluctantly, he let go. The absence of his touch felt like a physical wound. "Thank you," Julian said to the driver, his voice steady and normal, as if nothing earth-shattering had just occurred. As if he hadn't just reached across the careful distance I'd spent 44 years building and touched something I'd forgotten I possessed. He opened the door and stepped out into the rain, and I watched through the water-streaked window as he hurried toward the entrance of his building. He didn't look back, didn't wave, just disappeared into the warm light of the lobby, leaving me alone with the driver and the lingering scent of his cologne. The car pulled away from the curb, continuing toward my stop, and I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the window. My hand was still warm from his touch, and I could feel the phantom pressure of his fingers against mine. The wedding ring on my finger felt like it was burning. Cold fire against my skin, a reminder of promises made and lives built, and the intricate web of obligations that defined every moment of my existence. I twisted it unconsciously, the way I'd done 1,000 times before when I was nervous or uncertain. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, it felt like a cage. I closed my eyes and let the motion of the car rock me gently as we headed toward home, toward my real life, toward everything I was supposed to be. But Julian's touch lingered on my skin like a ghost, and I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that nothing would ever be the same again. A week passed before I could stop thinking about his hand in mine. I threw myself back into the familiar rhythms of my life with the determination of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. Monday morning found me in my office downtown, surrounded by blueprints and historical surveys, studying the bone structure of buildings that had outlived their creators. I work in architectural preservation, a profession that suits me, perhaps too well. I spend my days ensuring that facades remain intact, that the external beauty of old structures is maintained even when their interiors have been gutted and rebuilt beyond recognition. The irony was not lost on me. My office overlooked a small courtyard where ivy climbed the brick walls of a 19th-century warehouse we'd converted into luxury condominiums. I watched office workers take their lunch breaks on the benches below, their lives intersecting briefly before scattering again into the anonymity of the city. From my window, they looked purposeful, content. I envied them their simplicity. I am 44 years old. I have been married to Clara for 15 years, and we have 2 children, Emma, 13, and David, 10. We live in a colonial in Westchester with a 2-car garage and a garden that Clara tends with the same careful attention she brings to everything in our life. The house is beautiful, tasteful, filled with warm light and good furniture and the accumulated artifacts of a family that has grown together over time. It is also, I realized with growing clarity, a museum of my own making. Every evening, I took the train home from the city, watching the suburbs unfold through the window like a promise of peace. I would walk from the station to our house, past sidewalks lined with maple trees and front yards where children played while their parents chatted over property lines. Our neighbors knew me as the man who organized the holiday block party, who volunteered for the school fundraiser every spring, who could be counted on to help carry groceries or jumpstart a dead battery. I had built a reputation for reliability, for being steady, devoted, good. At dinner, Clara would tell me about her day teaching at the elementary school, about parent conferences and curriculum changes and the small dramas that filled her world. Emma would complain about her algebra teacher or gossip about friends whose names I struggled to keep straight. David would demonstrate his latest magic trick or show me a drawing he'd made of our dog, Milo, who had died 2 years ago but still appeared regularly in his artwork. I listened. I nodded. I asked the appropriate questions and made the expected responses. But increasingly, I felt like an actor who had been playing the same role for so long that he'd forgotten there had ever been a script. Clara would fall asleep easily, her breathing settling into the steady rhythm of someone whose conscience was clear. I would lie beside her in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, counting the small sounds that punctuated our nighttime quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the settling of old wood, the distant whisper of cars on the highway. It was during these wakeful hours that I would think about the drawer. In my home office, tucked away in the bottom drawer of an antique desk that had belonged to Clara's grandfather, I kept a collection of artifacts from the person I used to be. Old letters from college friends whose lives had taken them to places I'd only read about. Photographs from trips I'd taken before marriage, before children, before the weight of responsibility had settled over my shoulders like a heavy coat I couldn't remove. There was a notebook filled with sketches of cities I'd never visited. Prague with its medieval spires, Istanbul where east met west, small villages in Tuscany where light fell differently than anywhere else I'd ever seen. I had drawn these places from guidebooks and travel magazines, creating careful architectural studies of buildings I would never touch, streets I would never walk. And then there was the photograph. It was small, creased at the corners, slightly blurry as if the camera had moved at the moment of capture. A group of us around a bonfire somewhere in upstate New York during my junior year of college. Most faces were lost to shadow, but in the foreground, caught in the flickering light of the flames, a young man was laughing at something just outside the frame. His head was thrown back, his eyes bright with joy, and something about the unself-conscious abandon of the moment had made someone, I could never remember who, reach for a camera. I kept this photograph hidden beneath the notebooks and letters, a secret even I didn't fully understand. Sometimes, late at night when Clara was asleep, I would take it out and study it in the dim light of my desk lamp. The boy in the photo looked so alive, so unguarded, so different from the careful man I had become. I couldn't remember his name, couldn't recall what had made him laugh, or where he'd gone after graduation, or why this single moment had felt important enough to preserve. But looking at him now, 23 years later, I recognized something in his expression that I'd lost somewhere along the way. It was the look of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of his own desires. That week, as I moved through my daily routines with mechanical precision, I found myself thinking about Julian's touch and the boy in the photograph as if they were connected by invisible threads. Two moments separated by decades, both carrying the same electric charge of possibility, both equally dangerous to the carefully constructed life I'd spent so many years building. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between bills and catalogs in our mailbox like a small rebellion against the ordinary. Sarah Chun, a colleague from the Preservation Society, was curating a show in Chelsea, something about urban decay and renewal, the kind of conceptual work that had once excited me but now felt like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. Clara looked at the thick cardstock over my shoulder as I read it at the kitchen counter. She said I should go, that I never did anything for myself anymore, that a night in the city would be good for me. There was something wistful in her voice, as if she recognized that the man she'd married had once been the type who belonged at gallery openings, surrounded by wine and avant-garde photography and conversations that lasted until dawn. I almost didn't go. The train into the city felt like traveling backward through time, each station carrying me further from the comfortable predictability of my suburban life and closer to something I couldn't name. By the time I emerged from the subway into the electric buzz of Chelsea, I was questioning the wisdom of this small act of nostalgia. The gallery was exactly what I remembered and nothing like I expected. The space was raw, industrial, exposed brick walls and concrete floors, track lighting casting dramatic shadows across canvases that seemed to breathe in the dim light. There was something about places like this that had always moved me. The way they transformed abandoned warehouses into cathedrals of possibility. The way they made beauty from brokenness. I used to love this world. The openings and readings and late-night discussions about art and meaning and the ways human beings tried to make sense of their brief time on Earth. I had been different then, younger, certainly, but also more open, more willing to let mystery and beauty enter my life without demanding explanations. Sarah found me standing before a series of photographs documenting the demolition of a 19th-century opera house in Detroit. The images were haunting. Ornate plasterwork crumbling into dust, velvet seats twisted into abstract sculptures by time and neglect. Beauty dying in real time. She introduced me to people I should know, colleagues and critics and artists whose names I recognized from reviews I'd read, but forgotten. I made polite conversation, sipped wine that was better than anything we kept at home, and tried to remember how to exist in this version of myself. That's when I met Julian. He was standing alone near a wall of smaller pieces, studying a black and white photograph with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was actually seeing something rather than simply looking. Sarah introduced us in passing. Julian Morrison, she said, a friend of a friend who worked in rare book acquisition for the public library. Someone who might appreciate my perspective on historical preservation. He was younger than me, mid-30s perhaps, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm but not aggressive, and he held my gaze just long enough to suggest he was actually interested in meeting me. We started talking about the photographs, about the way the artist had captured both destruction and grace in the same frame. Julian had a way of listening that I'd forgotten existed. Complete attention without the fidgeting or mental preparation of a response that characterized most social interactions. When I mentioned that I worked in preservation, he asked questions that went beyond politeness, genuine curiosity about the challenge of maintaining historical integrity in a world that seemed determined to tear everything down and start over. The conversation evolved naturally, the way good conversations do when two people discover they speak the same language. We talked about architecture, about the books we'd been reading, about films I hadn't thought about in years. Julian had just finished a biography of Louis Kahn, and when he described the architect's philosophy about spaces that wanted to be versus spaces that were forced to be, I felt something stir in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. Recognition. Connection. The electric charge of finding someone who understood not just what you were saying, but what you weren't saying as well. We ended up in a corner of the gallery, the crowd flowing around us as if we were a small island of stillness in the social current. I lost track of time completely. The wine made everything softer around the edges, but it was more than alcohol that made me feel loosened, more present than I'd been in months. There was something about Julian that disarmed me. The way he asked about my family without prying. The way he mentioned traveling to Prague, one of the cities I'd sketched so many times from guidebooks, and described the light falling across the Charles Bridge at dawn as if he knew I would understand why such details mattered. When the evening finally wound down and we found ourselves on the sidewalk with a small group planning to continue the night at a restaurant in the village, it felt natural to share a cab. Then another a few weeks later when we ran into each other at a lecture about urban planning. Then another after a dinner with mutual friends who had somehow become the excuse for us to see each other without acknowledging that we were making excuses. Julian became a quiet presence in my carefully ordered life. Text messages about books I might enjoy. Invitations to exhibitions I would have missed otherwise. Conversations that started innocent and wandered into territory I hadn't explored in years. Memory and regret, and the strange ways that time could fold back on itself when you least expected it. I told myself it was friendship. Nothing more complicated than two people who enjoyed each other's company and conversation. But late at night, lying awake beside Clara, I knew I was lying to myself. There was something building between us, slow and careful, and entirely too dangerous for a man with my responsibilities. The changes started small. A sketchbook that appeared on my desk at work, its pages blank and patient. My hand reaching for it during phone calls. Pen moving across paper without conscious direction, drawing the view from my office window, as if I were seeing it for the first time. Lines and shadows that I'd forgotten how to capture. Architectural details that had been invisible to me for years suddenly demanding attention. I hadn't sketched anything in over a decade. The discovery that my hands still remembered how felt like finding a muscle I'd thought was dead. At home, I began reading again. Not the technical journals and preservation manuals that cluttered my office, but novels I'd loved in college, poetry collections that had once moved me to tears, essays about art and travel, and the ways human beings navigate the space between longing and belonging. I would sit in my office after Clara and the children had gone to bed, surrounded by these recovered treasures, feeling like an archaeologist excavating his own past. Clara noticed. She would pass by the open door and see me bent over a book, or find the sketchbook left open on the kitchen counter, and I would catch something in her expression, not disapproval exactly, but confusion, as if she were watching a stranger inhabit her husband's body. We had grown so accustomed to our routines that any deviation felt seismic. For 15 years, I had been predictable in the way that married people become predictable. The same newspaper at breakfast, the same route to the train station, the same television programs watched in comfortable silence after dinner. Now I was reaching for different books, taking different paths through the neighborhood, looking up from my plate during meals as if I were listening for something just beyond the range of normal hearing. Julian and I began meeting for coffee. Nothing planned or formal, just text messages suggesting we grab lunch near his library or mentioning that I would be in his neighborhood for a work meeting. The conversations from the gallery opening expanded and deepened, moving through topics I hadn't discussed with anyone in years. He told me about growing up in a small town in Vermont where everyone knew everyone else's business, about the relief he'd felt when he finally escaped to college, and then to the city where anonymity felt like freedom. I found myself talking about architecture in ways I hadn't since graduate school, not the practical aspects of my work, but the philosophy behind it, the way buildings could hold memory, the way spaces could shape the people who inhabited them. We would walk through neighborhoods I'd worked in, and I would point out details he might have missed, the way a cornice had been restored with modern materials that looked authentic from the street but revealed their true nature up close, or the subtle violence done to a 19th century facade when someone added inappropriate signage. Julian listened with the same focused attention he'd shown at the gallery, asking questions that revealed he understood not just what I was explaining, but why it mattered to me. There were afternoons when we would spend hours in museums or galleries, moving through exhibitions with the slow deliberation of people who had nowhere else to be. Julian had a way of seeing art that was different from mine, more intuitive, less concerned with technical execution than with emotional resonance. He would stand before a painting for long minutes, completely absorbed, and when he finally spoke, it would be to say something that reframed everything I thought I'd understood about the piece. It was during one of these gallery walks, as we stood before a series of photographs documenting the daily life of men in a small Greek fishing village, that Julian asked the question that changed everything. We had been discussing the way the photographer had captured intimacy without intrusion, the careful balance between observation and participation. The images were beautiful and frank, men working together, eating together, their relationships visible in the spaces between their bodies, the ease of long familiarity. Julian was quiet for a long time, studying one particular photograph of two men sitting on a dock, their shoulders touching, their faces turned toward the sea. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost casual. "Were you ever in love with a man?" he asked. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I felt my throat close, my carefully constructed defenses rising like walls. I could have laughed it off, could have deflected with humor or changed the subject entirely. Instead, I said nothing at all. Julian didn't push. He simply nodded, as if my silence had answered everything he needed to know, and we moved on to the next photograph. But the question followed me home that night, echoing in my head as I sat through Emma's practice recital, as I helped David with his science project, as I kissed Clara goodnight, and settled into my familiar insomnia. The piano recital was held on a Thursday evening in the school auditorium, one of those community events that punctuate suburban life with their mixture of pride and obligation. Clara and I sat in the third row, surrounded by other parents with their phones ready to capture their children's moments of triumph or terror. Emma played Chopin beautifully, her 13-year-old fingers finding their way through a nocturne with surprising grace. I was focused entirely on her, swelling with the particular pride that comes from watching your child exceed your expectations, when I felt the familiar sensation of being watched. I turned my head and saw Julian 3 rows behind me, sitting alone near the aisle. Our eyes met across the crowded auditorium, and something passed between us that felt like recognition and terror in equal measure. He raised his hand slightly, not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement, and I nodded back, my heart beating too fast. Later, during intermission, he found me in the lobby. A mutual friend had mentioned the recital, he explained, and he'd decided to come support the school music program. The explanation was perfectly reasonable, entirely innocent, and yet I felt exposed in a way that made my skin burn. When I introduced him to Clara, I watched her take his measure with the quick efficiency of a woman who had been married long enough to recognize when something in her husband's world had shifted. She was polite, warm even, but I could see the questions forming behind her eyes. That night, lying in bed beside my sleeping wife, I understood with painful clarity that I was falling in love with Julian Morrison. And for the first time in my carefully constructed adult life, I didn't know how to stop myself. The greenhouse had been abandoned for decades, its glass panels clouded with age and neglect, its iron framework softened by rust and ivy. We found it by accident during one of our walks through Prospect Park, tucked away behind a grove of oak trees like a secret the city had forgotten to demolish. Julian pushed open the door, its hinges protesting with a sound like a sigh, and we stepped into what felt like a cathedral of light and decay. The afternoon sun filtered through the dirty glass and shafts that illuminated floating particles of dust and pollen, turning the air itself into something visible, almost tangible. Moss had claimed the stone benches and walkways, and wild plants had pushed through cracks in the concrete floor, creating an ecosystem that existed somewhere between cultivation and wilderness. It was beautiful in the way that ruins are beautiful, not despite their decay, but because of it, because they show you what remains when human ambition meets the patient persistence of time. We walked slowly through the space, our footsteps muffled by the soft carpet of fallen leaves and moss. Julian ran his fingers along the rusted framework, tracing the bones of what had once been someone's vision of controlled paradise. There was something reverent in the way he moved through the space, as if he understood that we were trespassing not just on property, but on memory. I found myself sketching again, my pen moving across paper without conscious direction, trying to capture the interplay of light and shadow, the way nature had reclaimed this human structure and made it into something entirely new. Julian watched me work, standing close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body in the cool air of the greenhouse. When I finished, he asked to see the sketch, and I handed it over with the vulnerability of someone sharing a prayer. He studied it for a long time, his eyes moving from the paper to the actual space around us and back again. "You see things differently than most people," he said finally. "The way you find beauty in what's broken." We settled on one of the moss-covered benches, the stone cold through our clothes, but somehow welcoming. The greenhouse felt removed from time, insulated from the noise and urgency of the city beyond its walls. Here, surrounded by the gentle decay of someone else's dreams, it was easier to speak truths that would have felt impossible anywhere else. Julian told me about his childhood then, about growing up in a house where silence was safer than honesty. His father had left when Julian was 12, not dramatically, but gradually, working later hours, taking longer business trips, until one day he simply didn't come home at all. His mother had never recovered from the abandonment, not really. She'd spent Julian's adolescence building walls against further disappointment, creating a home where feelings were dangerous things that could destroy you if you let them surface. He learned early to keep his secrets locked away, he said, to present whatever version of himself felt safest in any given moment. The habit had followed him into adulthood, into relationships that felt like performances rather than connections. I understood. I had built my own elaborate theater of respectability, my own careful choreography of expected behavior. We sat in the fading light of the greenhouse, two men who had spent their lives perfecting the art of hiding in plain sight. The confession came without warning, rising from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "I don't know who I am when I'm with you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to be anyone else." The words hung in the air between us like something physical. Julian turned to face me fully, and I saw in his eyes the same mixture of fear and recognition that I felt in my own chest. The careful distance we had maintained for months collapsed in an instant. He didn't speak. Instead, he simply moved closer, closing the space between us on the narrow bench until I could feel his breath on my face, could count the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only moments, suspended in the possibility of a choice that would change everything. We didn't kiss. Something held us back, perhaps the weight of what such a gesture would mean, or the understanding that once crossed, this particular line could never be uncrossed. But the intention was there, electric and undeniable, in the space between our faces. That evening, alone in my office while Clara graded papers downstairs and the children finished their homework, I pulled out the photograph again. The boy by the bonfire, caught in that moment of unself-conscious joy. I stared at his face in the lamplight, trying to remember his name, his voice, the texture of conversations we must have had. And suddenly, With the clarity that comes from finally asking the right question, I remembered. His name was Michael. He had been my roommate's friend from high school, visiting for the weekend during our junior year. We had talked for hours that night around the fire, about books and movies, and the vast uncertainty of life after college. There had been something between us, unspoken but unmistakable, a current of attraction that I had dismissed at the time as friendship, as the natural camaraderie of young men finding their way in the world. But looking at the photograph now, seeing the way the firelight caught his face, the way his laughter seemed directed at me rather than at some shared joke, I understood that it had been more than friendship. It had been my first experience of love for another man, buried so deep beneath the expectations of who I was supposed to become that I had convinced myself it had never happened at all. The timeline of my life suddenly rearranged itself in my mind. All the choices I had made, all the doors I had closed, all the careful steps that had led me to this suburban existence, they all traced back to that moment by the fire when I had felt something dangerous and beautiful and had chosen, without even realizing I was choosing, to turn away from it. Julian was the first person since Michael to make me remember what it felt like to be seen completely, to be understood not just for what I presented to the world, but for who I actually was beneath all the careful construction. He was offering me a key to doors I had spent 23 years pretending didn't exist. And for the first time since that night by the bonfire, I was almost brave enough to use it. Clara knew before I did that something had changed. Women have a radar for these things, the subtle shifts in attention, the way a man starts looking past his life rather than into it. She watched me with the careful observation of someone who had invested 15 years in reading my expressions, my silences, my tells. It happened on a Saturday morning in April. I was sitting at the kitchen table, ostensibly reading the newspaper, but actually staring out the window at the garden where daffodils were pushing through the last patches of snow. Clara was making coffee, moving through her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of repetition, when she suddenly stopped and turned to face me. "Is there someone else?" she asked. Not accusatory, not angry, just tired. The question hit me like cold water. I looked up at her, really looked, and saw the woman I had married, still beautiful at 42, still kind, still deserving of a husband who could love her completely. Her dark hair was pulled back in the loose bun she favored on weekends, and she was wearing the blue robe I had given her for Christmas 3 years ago. I could have lied, should have lied. The truth was too complicated, too dangerous to the careful structure we had built together. But something in her expression told me she already knew, that she was simply offering me the chance to confirm what she had already pieced together from my absences, my distraction, my gradual retreat from the intimacy we had once shared. "Not in the way you think," I said finally. She poured her coffee with steady hands, added cream, stirred slowly. Then she sat down across from me at the table where we had shared thousands of meals, where we had helped our children with homework, where we had planned vacations and discussed mortgages and built the mundane architecture of a shared life. "But there is someone," she said. I nodded. "Yes." She cried then, quietly, tears running down her cheeks as she held her coffee cup between her hands like an anchor. I wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but I understood that my touch was part of the problem now, not part of the solution. The days that followed were agony. I deleted Julian's number from my phone, then retrieved it from the trash. I threw myself into family obligations with the desperate energy of a man trying to prove to himself that he could still be who everyone needed him to be. I coached David's Little League practice, attended Emma's science fair, took Clara to dinner at the restaurant where we had celebrated our 10th anniversary. But everything felt false now. Performance rather than presence. I moved through these familiar motions like an actor who had forgotten his motivation, going through the blocking without understanding the play. Clara and I maintained a careful politeness, the kind of distant courtesy that couples develop when they are waiting for something to break or heal. We slept in the same bed, but did not touch. We spoke about schedules and logistics, but avoided anything that might lead us back to the conversation that hung between us like a sword. After 2 weeks of this careful choreography, I couldn't stand it anymore. I called Julian from my office downtown, my hands shaking as I dialed. We arranged to meet in Riverside Park at sunset, a neutral space where we could walk and talk without the weight of walls around us. He was waiting on a bench overlooking the Hudson River when I arrived, the late afternoon light catching the water, and turning it into molten gold. He looked older somehow, more tired, as if the separation had cost him something too. We walked in silence for a while, following the path that ran parallel to the water. Families were picnicking on the grass, children were playing on the playground, couples were jogging past us with the easy rhythm of people who had found their pace together. Normal life continuing around us while we navigated the collapse of everything I had thought I understood about myself. Finally, I found the words. "I don't know how to be brave," I told him. My voice was barely audible over the sound of traffic and water and the ordinary noise of the city around us. "But I don't want to keep pretending." Julian stopped walking and turned to face me. In the fading light, his expression was gentle, sad, understanding. "You don't have to choose me," he said quietly. "Just don't choose silence." That night, I found Clara in the living room, grading papers at the coffee table while a documentary about polar bears played softly on the television. She looked up when I entered, and something in my face must have told her what was coming. I told her everything. About Julian, yes, but also about Michael and the boy by the bonfire whose laughter I had buried so deep that I had convinced myself it had never existed. About the way I had built my life like a fortress against my own desires. About the photograph hidden in my desk drawer and the sketches of places I would never visit and the slow suffocation of becoming someone I didn't recognize. I told her about the Uber ride and Julian's hand in mine and the way it had felt like coming home and falling apart simultaneously. I told her about the greenhouse and the moment when I had finally understood that I had been running from myself for 23 years. She listened without interrupting, her pen still in her hand, but her attention entirely focused on my words. When I finished, the silence stretched between us like a gulf that could not be bridged. Then she set down her pen, looked at me with eyes that held 15 years of shared history, and quietly left the room. I sat alone in the living room as the documentary continued its narration about survival in impossible climates, watching images of creatures who had learned to adapt to environments that should have killed them. Outside, the suburban night settled over our neighborhood with its familiar sounds of sprinklers and distant televisions and the soft murmur of lives being lived behind lit windows. For the first time in decades, I had told the complete truth about who I was. The relief was overwhelming and terrible, like finally breathing after holding your breath for so long you had forgotten what air felt like. The house felt different in the silence that followed. Not empty exactly, but hollowed out, like a shell that had once held something precious and now contained only echoes. Clara had gone to stay with her sister for a few days, taking Emma with her. David was at a sleepover, his absence marked by the unusual quiet from his room where no music played, no video games beeped their electronic urgencies into the night. I walked through the rooms as if seeing them for the first time, noticing details that had become invisible through years of familiarity. The way the morning light fell across the dining room table, where we had shared so many meals. The small chip in the living room wall where David had thrown a baseball, despite being told repeatedly to play outside. The photographs that lined the hallway. Our wedding day, the children as babies, family vacations to beaches and mountains where we had all smiled at the camera with the practiced ease of people who knew how to look happy. In each image, I could see myself performing the role of husband, father, provider. The expressions were genuine enough, the love real. But looking at them now, I understood that I had been living at one remove from my own life, experiencing everything through the filter of what was expected rather than what was felt. The silence was overwhelming at first, pressing against my eardrums like water. But gradually, I began to hear the smaller sounds that had always been there beneath the noise of family life. The hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the house's old bones, the whisper of wind through the trees outside. The ordinary symphony of a place where people had tried to build something lasting. I found myself in my office eventually, drawn to the drawer that had held my secrets for so long. The photograph was still there, creased and fading. Michael by the bonfire, caught in that moment of unguarded joy that I had finally learned to remember completely. I held it up to the lamplight, studying his face as if it might offer some guidance for navigating the unknown territory I now found myself in. Beside it, I placed another photograph. Julian had taken it without my knowledge a few weeks ago when we were sitting in a cafe near his library. I had been sketching the view from our window, old brownstones catching the afternoon light, completely absorbed in the simple pleasure of translating what I saw into lines on paper. Julian had captured me in that moment of unconscious focus, unaware of being observed, unguarded in a way I rarely allowed myself to be. The two photographs side by side told a story I was only beginning to understand. Two moments of authenticity separated by more than 20 years, bookends to a life lived largely in hiding. The boy by the fire and the man in the cafe, both versions of someone I had forgotten how to be. I took out a piece of paper and began to write. Not to Clara, though she deserved words of explanation and apology that I was not yet equipped to offer. Not to Julian, though our future remained a question mark that would need addressing. Instead, I wrote to myself, to the part of me that had been buried beneath years of careful construction and dutiful performance. It was a letter of permission. Permission to stop pretending that desire was something that could be willed away or architected out of existence. Permission to mourn the years I had lost to fear and the pain I had caused to people who deserved better. Permission to begin again, even at 44, even with the wreckage of a family behind me, even without knowing what came next. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if a dam had finally burst. I wrote about the boy I had been and the man I had become and the person I might still learn to be. I wrote about love in all its forms, the deep, steady affection I felt for Clara and our children, different from but not diminished by the electric recognition I had found with Julian. I wrote about the architecture of a life and the courage required to tear down what no longer served in order to build something true. When I finished, I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with the photographs. A record of this moment, this choice, this small act of rebellion against the tyranny of other people's expectations. Then I walked to the front hall where my wedding ring had been sitting in a small ceramic bowl by the door for the past 3 days. Placed there the night, I told Clara the truth and couldn't bear the weight of it on my finger any longer. The ring looked smaller than I remembered, less significant, just a band of gold that had once symbolized promises I had made with the best of intentions, but could no longer keep. I picked up my jacket, checked my phone for the train schedule, and stepped outside into the evening air. The sun was setting behind the row of houses across the street, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the light Julian had described falling across the Charles Bridge in Prague. I walked toward the station without knowing exactly where I was going or what I would do when I got there. But for the first time in years, I was walking toward something rather than away from it. Toward truth instead of safety, toward the unknown instead of the predetermined. I was finally, painfully, completely awake.